Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Price Formation Enhancements Working Group session number 7. My name is Brenda Corona. On behalf of the Stakeholder Affairs Group, I welcome you to our session today where we'll be discussing, in response to stakeholder feedback, the priority topics. So today, ISO staff will be providing a review of existing market mechanisms as it relates to scarcity pricing, and hear other stakeholders' perspectives on the draft problem statements. So let's go ahead and go over housekeeping reminders that this call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. As we go on with these collaborative working groups, so we like to encourage open dialogue and hear and listen to every different perspective. So feel free to use the raise hand icon and ask a question in queue. To ask a question, make sure you use the lower toolbar raise hand. It'll add you onto our queue. Make sure you do not mute yourself. We will be unmuting you after we announce your name. And also feel free to announce your name and question when you're unmuted. And so we also have, maybe we'll be adding Slido today, but I'll double check on that. But other than that, we do have a lot of other slides we would like to go over first, and then we will let everyone know if we do have any questions. But other than that, feel free to submit them through chat, and I'll be sending out the meeting attendance report in the next 10 minutes so everyone can know who's on the call today. So that'll be like a link that's Excel spreadsheet. And then just a reminder for today's agenda, as mentioned, we have Scarcity Pricing 101. And then before that, we have Juan who will be going over today's goals, but then he'll send it off to CV for the Scarcity Pricing 101. And then James will be providing an overview of existing ISO comparative scarcity pricing concepts. And then lastly, Juan will wrap us up with the CAISO drafted problem statements and stakeholder discussion. So this is going to be like a longer meeting. So we have extended that. So we definitely want to make sure we have time for everyone for their questions. So feel free to give us any feedback on that as well. But other than that, we will go ahead and go on the next 2 slides. These are already mentioned from prior meetings, just where we're at in terms of the policy initiative stakeholder process. So we are at the beginning part of the pre-proposal development phase. And then just right here, I think I'll go ahead and hand it off to Juan. He'll kick us off for the working group deliverables and slides.
Thank you, Brenda, and thank you everybody for making the time to join us here today for this working group session. I got a couple of slides before I hand it over to Sylvie Spiewak for Scarcity Pricing 101. This is one that, if we can move to the next slide, please. This is one that I like to bring for us. Again, let's have the end in mind of the working group deliverables. Again, this conversation is to inform that proposal development, and that will be done through that action plan. And you can see this wonderful graphic here showing that iterative process that is the working group itself. And then if we could go ahead and move into the next slide, I wanted to kind of provide a similar visualization for the working group to date, not just the working group construct, but here as we are in PFE. So we wanted to start off with providing adequate framing and level setting on the policy area. I have it done here. That might be early for the beginning of the slide, but hopefully, we've done a lot of level set on BAA, MPM. We heard overwhelmingly from stakeholders that the key theme that wanted to be explored further was a review of existing ISO market mechanisms as relates to this area. We're addressing that today. Now, just because we have that done does not mean that we cannot further expand upon a review of these mechanisms. We can leverage comparative analysis moving forward as well. We will also have a survey that comes out to you. So in case there are any areas that you feel need kind of further clarification, or you would just like to have deeper discussion on a review of the existing mechanisms, we'll be able to address that. But as of today, this will be the final kind of thematic session covering the review, and we're really moving into what we are in progress of and what is the tail end of this session, which would be going through a stakeholder discussion of some drafted problem statements that ISO has put board, again, drafted problem statements to kind of serve as a launching point, and of course not an exclusive list for stakeholder problem statements. And several of you, through your comments, have provided problem statements, and we really appreciate that. We're going to be diving into those problem statements and the applicable themes moving forward. So where we are in progress right now, as far as the PFE working group, we're still in that issue challenge identification, and this is where I am really looking to you as a stakeholder community to please share your thoughts. And I want to go even further and ask that today we don't assume that the ISO understands your position. I would like to ask for you to really engage, really share those thoughts, and allow that to inform the larger discussion amongst the stakeholders we have on this call here. Let that be kind of riffed upon, or questioned, agreed upon, so that we can really start and stimulate this dialogue. The problem statements, again, go from that issue and challenge identification. It's translating those issues into actionable items. What could we do to try to solve those problem statements is the ultimate goal. If you take a look at the visualization down on the bottom right-hand corner, we have a problem statement, we can refine it, we can take calls for different data to kind of illustrate that problem statement. We're assessing that problem statement and refining it, and that will lead to the resolution, which is ultimately the end goal here. So today we're starting the assessment on the CAISO drafted problem statements, but again, I don't want to close the door. You'll see in progress on both issue and challenge identification, as well as the problem statements themselves, that will ultimately lead to the resolving of the issues, identifying existing opportunities to do so, and beginning to talk about those potential solutions. That's further down in the process, but I wanted to show how what we're doing today will inevitably lead us to our end goal. So if we could just move on to the next slide here. Thank you for that. So the goals for today's sessions, we are going to begin the thematic sessions. Overwhelmingly, again, it was a review of existing ISO market mechanisms. So I've invited both Sylvie Spiewak and James Friedrich to this session, and I'm looking forward to their presentation and ensuring that you have an opportunity to have your questions answered there. We're going to review the CAISO market mechanisms for scarcity pricing. We're going to explore existing scarcity pricing concepts that perhaps we could leverage as we begin to formulate and further refine these problem statements, kind of set that foundation for that comparative analysis. Again, kind of going to that assessment portion of the problem statement flow that you saw on the previous slide. And then again, at the end, we are going to go through these CAISO drafted problem statements. So I just want to reiterate that these are meant to serve as conversation starters. I'm really looking for this community to weigh in here and have a very open discussion. We need that stakeholder feedback. So again, please share your positions, share what data you need if you feel like you cannot form a position right now. What can we do to assist you in then being able to arrive to that and begin this conversation and this back and forth? And remember, when we're taking a look at a problem statement, or let me back up a second. When we're taking a look at an issue statement or a challenge statement and turning it into a problem statement, we're really looking for what measurable actions come to mind within that issue or challenge area that we can then leverage into refining that problem statement to eventually lead to those solutions. So I appreciate you guys working through a couple of these retread slides as far as the action plan, but really excited for this conversation. I've been really excited to kind of get into the themes that we have put into the discussion paper. And again, those were all garnered from the conversations that we've had with this community. So at this point, I think we can go ahead and move to the next slide. And I'd like to introduce Sylvie Spiewak to go through, this is kind of a scarcity pricing 101, a review of the existing mechanisms. So Sylvie, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Juan. I really appreciate that you said don't assume that we understand your point of view. I started thinking about these ideas after the first couple of working groups. So I wanted to put together a really brief and simple example of what we mean by scarcity pricing that reflects some of the concerns that we heard from stakeholders in those first few working groups, help contextualize the deeper ideas that James will go through, and hopefully provide a simple visual reference for some of the problem statements that we'll review later this afternoon. So this is Scarcity Pricing 101. Get excited. Next slide. I think this is the start of James's presentation. Can we go to, hold on, slide 29, perhaps? There we go. That's Scarcity Pricing 101. So as a market operator, our goal is to keep supply and demand balanced at all times. And if we don't, we get blackouts. We want to avoid blackouts in the most efficient way possible. And one of the big challenges here is that demand is relatively inelastic. Load doesn't react to real-time price signals. And when you think about other markets, not electricity markets, where demand is inelastic for something, insulin is the classic example, you might think really high prices, lack of competition, and a lot of risk. Electricity markets figured out a way to manage this a long time ago through least cost dispatch and uniform price auction on the supply side. Go to the next slide. So this is an example of least cost dispatch. We dispatch from least to highest cost. Uniform price auction creates that competitive conditions that make up for the fact that load is inelastic. So this looks like a perfectly competitive market. But it doesn't always work out, especially when there isn't enough supply. Next slide. If you move demand from D1 to D2, you get a supply shortfall. And we currently have a lot of market mechanisms and also a lot of regulations from various states and utilities that are intended to prevent this from ever happening. But there's always a level of uncertainty. So the idea of scarcity pricing, reliability, capacity markets, et cetera, are intended to account for that uncertainty in case this happens. Next slide. The orange dotted line in this slide represents an administratively set scarcity price, where the market operator might say at 300 megawatts, it costs $2,000 per megawatt, so that you get that additional revenue opportunity and potentially attract new resources to the market. But once you move past 300, you might see a fault in this logic. Basically, if you're looking at the slide, it's too late. Demand is paying $2,000 per megawatt hour, but then the power goes out anyway. So that revenue opportunity is really only applicable if there's already supply out there that you're trying to incentivize to deliver at that time. But the traditional idea of having an administratively set scarcity price is that when prices rise, load would respond in order to avoid being curtailed. And that is the basis of one of the problem statements that we had originally introduced. But I'll note that this price cap that you see here doesn't have to represent a scarcity price or an administratively set price. James is going to go into the difference between a price cap and a constraint violation penalty. And that's something that we use to incentivize resources to show up when we want them to. Next slide. So anytime you have an administratively increased price or an increased revenue opportunity, there's an opportunity for market power. And we do have market mechanisms to prevent market power. Market power mitigation is an obvious one, but there's also a lot of contracts for resource adequacy that have must-offer obligations, and our capacity market also includes obligations like that. Still, when you increase prices, there is that potential. So an operating reserve demand curve can help reduce the potential for market power by going down over time. So instead of a straight line, which represents an inelastic demand. It goes down, which says to resources that the incentive to withhold goes down over time, and they should put all of their resources on the market when we want them to. And that's it for my very basic level set. If James wanted to jump in and provide any color commentary for these illustrations, I'd be happy to hand it over. But otherwise, I'll take questions about any of this before heading into the deep dive.
Thank you, Sylvie. So, John from SRP, I do see your hand, but James, let's go ahead and let you provide color commentary on these visualizations. John, if that answers your question, then that's great. If not, we'll definitely take your comment. James, please go ahead.
Thanks, Juan. One thing I just wanted to emphasize here is that on Sylvie's first slide, the need for scarcity pricing comes about because of this the way load participates in the real-time market. And one of the functions of scarcity pricing is essentially to take place of, flexible load participation in real time and approximate, a sort of demand curve, if you will, for, how much load or consumers value a reliable electricity at that moment. And so one of the things to think about, if you had sort of perfectly flexible load participation where every consumer was able to demonstrate and signal to the market their willingness to avoid curtailment, you wouldn't need scarcity pricing because you would just be able to shut off consumers who are not willing to pay the prevailing price, and it sort of resolves itself. And so I just want people to keep in mind going through these discussions when in our upcoming discussion, we start talking about ancillary service demand curves and FRP demand curves and that sort of thing. That's sort of why that sort of function exists, is to replace that demand willingness to pay. So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Juan.
Thanks, James. And I'm just going to turn around and pass it over to John from SRP, if we could unmute his line.
Yes, so I just wanted to ask if you could give a little bit more explanation on the decrease in the scarcity price at the last moment that you were talking about there.
Sure.
Yeah, we can kind of just walk me through.
Yeah. So the idea is, if there's a resource, if there's a resource out there that has capacity to offer past this 300 megawatts, and we don't have the curve there, it has an incentive to continue to withhold, to make sure that scarcity prices increase, and then it can take advantage of that scarcity increase. So by having it decrease, as we go up the supply stack, it means that resources have more of an incentive to put their power online earlier now, instead of withholding to make the price go up, because the price won't go up. It will only go down.
Okay, I understand that. So it's intended to be sort of like a penalty for willfully withholding resources, waiting for the price to spike up higher. Got it. Okay, thank you.
Yep, exactly.
Question, John. Thank you. I see that JK from PG&E has her hand raised. Let's go ahead and unmute her line.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yep.
Hi, Sylvie and Juan. Thank you so much for presenting the visual. This is very helpful, and I guess it also provides some different views that we had before. I'd like to use the opportunity to request the CAISO to clarify is this the major objective we try to achieve through the scarcity pricing by preventing withholding in the condition when the price cap is raised?
I think that withholding is one of the problems that arise when you have like a scarcity pricing mechanism or an opportunity for increased revenue. So it's one of the problems that come out of some of these solutions to reliability, and they're necessary to address as we try to solve some of the other problems. See, James has his hand up.
JK, this is James, and I would say generally yes, but I would, my preferred language is just to flip exactly your statement of prevent withholding, and I would think of it as like maximizing participation. So I think, I'm not sure, yes, we don't want people to be withholding to trigger scarcity, but generally the incentives are hopefully designed that during scarce system conditions, you have as many resources offering into the market as possible to be able to resolve those scarce conditions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, James. Okay, I'd like to break down my question a little bit, if possible. I know we have still presentations afterwards. So Juan, please let me know when should I stop. I guess the thing, the main reason we ask the question is here because the figure actually shows a very specific design of the scarcity pricing, and you will say that the different objectives actually associated that could be with very different designs of scarcity pricing as well as the demand curve, and that's what PG&E raised in our past comments. And to break down even more, our question from here is these goals that we want to achieve through the scarcity pricing as stakeholders, we hope to request a further understanding why this is the best direction going that way, given there are many effective and established tools in the market already. For example, if the goal is to prevent exercising of market power, why do we think market power mitigation is not sufficient? And another, so actually when James mentioned, to maximize the participation, to fill the goal of relieve the or elevate the tight conditions of market, there are actually, I would say that's a slightly different goal from reducing the incentives from the for market power. And as raised in our comments, if the goal is actually to signal the market there is not sufficient supply, we don't want to show the pricing exactly at the moment because you want to actually attract the supply and give the time to attract the supply ahead of time. So there is a requirement of, showing the price, moving the supply curve, the demand curve a little bit ahead of time, and given there's an anticipated scarcity showing up in the future, right? And another goal is if you want to maximize the participation in terms of providing fair compensation to the units, then it's a different story because then you want to actually give the scarcity pricing at exactly the moment when the units are dispatched to clear the market. And both of these are actually will render a different design from the figure or the illustration that's shown here. So I guess what we try to say here is a better understanding of the specific goals and the priority of those goals that CAISO want to achieve will help the stakeholders to better form the discussion in the future.
I could not have
Kate.
said it better myself. Thank you for that comment. Yeah, there are different practical implications for the different formulations and the mechanisms that we use to ensure reliability. So we'll be going through what we currently use in the market, some of the problem statements, the issues that we've seen in it, and walking through some of the challenges that you noted in that comment. I also typed up a couple of the other issues that you brought up that we can maybe respond to, but I want to go to James first.
This is James. Thanks so much, JK. Insightful comments. I just want to emphasize, I think you're right. The goal does matter, and I think if we can go back to that figure, maybe it was 31 or 30, slide 31 or 32. Yeah, either of these is fine. So there's kind of two things going on that you're rightly pointing out, JK. I mean, one of them is scarcity pricing as it relates to an actual shortage. In this case, there isn't a sufficient supply to solve the demand, and you're going to have to start curtailing schedules. And the price with which that's done and process with which that's done is important. But there's also something separate that you mentioned, which is that in advance of this condition shown on the screen, there may be pricing mechanisms where you're signaling to the market early than the actual shortage that some impending reliability condition is happening, to signal to the market you want as much supply available or demand to get off the system as possible. And I kind of think those are two different ways of looking at it, but both of them are important. You know, and when we talked to the Market Surveillance Committee a few weeks ago, I tried to emphasize, and I'll have a slide later on in the presentation about, you know, one of our problem statements that we're going to be putting out is that there's not enough sort of pre-signal embedded within our market to incentivize this type of behavior, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But I just wanted to point out we're definitely understand that distinction there.
Thanks for that, James and JK. Sylvie, please go ahead if you want to add on.
A couple of things. JK, you had mentioned that we would want to see scarcity pricing or some sort of pricing mechanism kick in earlier than I think the next slide shows. And I think that also gets to what James just pointed out. There are different ideas at play here. If we're looking at a price cap intended to incent load to change behavior, that's one thing. If we want a price that's intended to ensure deliverability, that's another thing. So when those prices kick in, how they kick in, and whether or not they come with, you know, market power issues are all things that we would need to look at on, you know, a problem by problem basis.
Well put, Sylvie. That's where I was driving. That's a JK. I appreciate that comment, because it does drive into, you know, several of the thematic areas. We go back to, you know, our guiding principles and taking a look at those trade-offs. So this is precisely, you bring a smile to my face, because this is precisely the conversation we're hoping to have. So thank you for that. And as James mentioned, we are going to not only have him go a little bit deeper into the scarcity pricing mechanism that might kind of further illustrate, but later on in this session, it does kind of tee up one of our proposed problem statements really nicely. So Sylvie, great presentation. We have a couple other hands, if you don't mind. Let's go ahead and go to Steve Keene at SCE.
The one thing that strikes me with this and the idea of like pulling in resources is that most of the time, at least in the CAISO, we shouldn't have to. That's what RA with its must offer obligations is, you know, it's supposed to ensure that with very few exceptions, there's sufficient resources that entities, you know, that there's no point to them withholding or pricing other than their marginal cost. So I think that needs to be a part of the discussion as well. And that, you know, if we're talking about the, you know, maybe a couple times a year where RA isn't sufficient, okay. I think that discussion changes a little bit if we're talking about scarcity pricing once EDAM is functioning, because EDAM there's not going to be a must offer obligation. It switches to the RSE, which is a different concept, and I'm not sure is going to work the same way. So that to me is something we need to keep in mind, and that I'm trying to, you know, that I try and at least think through how that's going to impact the various things. And you know, the other difference that I see there is that there's scarcity pricing will affect different markets. So in the CAISO, we're optimizing not just energy, but also ancillary services. And when EDAM comes, the IRP, that same optimization isn't going to happen in the other EDAM entities, right? They're not optimizing ancillary services as well. So I'm not certain what, you know, like putting scarcity pricing in the CAISO for ancillary services, I'm not sure how that's going to impact the overall market, because it's only going to be it's only going to affect a part of EDAM, not all of EDAM. And I haven't been able to think through what the potential implications of that are. And I think that's definitely something that needs to be considered going forward.
Yeah, agreed. We've also been noodling through that issue. I think I think we've tried to capture it in the discussion paper as well. At least the issue that you just mentioned of there being different like RA or resource efficiency constructs across the EDAM footprint, so it's not consistent, and therefore what does scarcity pricing look like? That's a challenge that hopefully we can talk through in these working groups. I also heard you say RA is supposed to incentivize the must offer obligations, these resources coming in at marginal cost. Exactly. I mentioned that as something that actually helps a lot with market power, because market power is the withholding of supply in order to increase price. So RA plays a crucial role in making sure that the worst doesn't happen here, and that scarcity pricing, when we need it, in those few times a year when RA is insufficient, is doing what we want it to, as opposed to allowing for market power. So there's a lot of things at play there that we'll need to disentangle through these working groups. So I think you hit the nail on the head with those issues.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And thank you, Stephen. We're going to be, as Sylvia mentioned, we did incorporate that as kind of one of the themes in the discussion paper. So we're looking forward to getting a lot more in depth into that problem, and hopefully coming together to identify those problem statements so that we can move forward on how is it that we all together, approach that challenge. So, John, I saw your hand go up and down a couple of times. I want to kind of give you the opportunity if there was an additional comment there, or if not, we can toss it on over to Sylvie for any closing thoughts, and then back to James. Okay. So Sylvie, let's go ahead and give you the floor for some closing thoughts, and we can toss it over to James.
I'm not sure I have much else. It was great to hear the comments that just came through, because those were all thoughts that I've had and challenges that we're going to need to address. So I'm glad that this very short presentation was able to spur those ideas. And if throughout James's presentation or the rest of these working groups, as we go through these more complex topics, you need a visual representation like these, let us know, and we'll break them down.
Thank you very much, Sylvie. So with that, my producer, if we could please go to slide 10. And James, floor is yours.
Thank you, Juan. So for context of this presentation, Juan asked that I provide, based on some stakeholder comments to the working groups, a overview of the existing CAISO market mechanisms for scarcity pricing. So I've done my best to sort of separate them out into these 4 components. And so the presentation will sort of follow along in its order. The first is reserve shortage pricing. This is something we'll talk about more, but it's, you know, the CAISO does have AS scarcity pricing. Our hypothesis is that it doesn't work as well as it should. And we might get into a little bit of that today, but we discussed that at the Market Surveillance Committee meeting a few weeks ago. But we'll talk a little bit about the mechanics of how that works. Second, scarcity pricing can be effectuated through power balance constraint violations, which typically is the common way people think about scarcity pricing, or the scarcity price is the price associated with a power balance constraint violation. But there's certainly a lot of different elements to scarcity pricing, not just that one. Number 3, specific events that happen during either load shedding or activation of demand response or other emergency resources. And the theme for number 3, those elements are not necessarily, you know, scarcity pricing per se, but they are actions that the market takes or things the market does during emergency conditions that help the market sustain emergency price levels. So it's kind of scarcity pricing, not quite the same as the first 2, but we'll talk a little bit about that. And then, of course, FERC Order 831 conditions represent times when triggers certain changes in offer caps and penalty prices. And so we'll talk about that, and represents ways where suppliers can change their offer or submit certain cost verified offers to make sure that they're recovering their costs in tight system conditions. So hopefully this provides a pretty good overview of the mechanics. Let's dig into the next slide. Okay, so I do have a numerical example in the middle of this presentation, but to be able to understand the numerical example, we have to go through the concept of what's called a surplus variable. So markets, you know, our market runs a least cost optimization problem subject to various constraints. And constraints in a normal optimization problem, if a constraint binds, the problem sort of shuts down and says there's no solution can be found. And of course, in our market, that's not a appropriate outcome. And so markets use these things called surplus variables. Sometimes you might have heard them as slack variables or penalty variables, such that they take value when the market needs to violate a constraint or a requirement. And that ensures that the market optimization can always find a solution even when it has to violate constraints. So surplus variables are integrated into the optimization's objective function, and there's a surplus variable for all types of requirements and constraints in the market. And they come with an associated penalty cost, and all of the penalty costs for various constraints and requirements are all listed in our tariff and business practice manuals. So when you see those dollar values, and we'll show an example of some of those on an upcoming slide, you can think of those as the penalty costs associated with surplus variables, and that's how they're integrated in the market. Now, the higher that the penalty cost of each surplus variable is, the less likely the optimization problem will violate the constraint. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Let's go on to slide 12. By the way, I'll be monitoring for hands that pop up. So if any attendee has a question or comment, please raise your hand and I'll stop at the end of the slide and call on you. Okay, so when the market solves, the surplus variables capture the degree to which the corresponding constraint it's associated with is violated. So if the market runs and no constraints are violated, then all of the surplus variables in the market take a value of 0. If there is a constraint that's violated, the surplus variable associated with that constraint takes some sort of value, some sort of number value. And the penalty price associated with that surplus variable gets added into the total cost of the solution. Next slide, please. Now, finally, on surplus variables and penalty prices have different functions depending on if you're talking about the scheduling run and the pricing run. You may be familiar that the CAISO has sort of 2 market runs. A scheduling run determines, in a sense, well, let's get into the sub-bullets and that will explain it. So penalty prices in the scheduling run determine the relative scheduling priority of each constraint or requirement. So in other words, it means which constraints or requirements to relax first in priority order. So the actual dollar value of the penalty prices in the scheduling run don't matter all that much other than to establish scheduling priority. So what really matters for penalty prices in the scheduling run are the hierarchical order of those prices. Now, if the scheduling run solves and shows no surplus variables take value, then that's passed on to the pricing run. But sometimes when constraints are relaxed, those surplus variables do take value in the scheduling run, and they're passed into the pricing run and essentially fixed within a small range. So, for example, I'll pick on, well, let's just say the power balance constraint violation, which is a constraint in the market that has a specific penalty price. And let's say that in order for the market to solve, they have to relax the power balance constraint by 5 megawatts. So that means that there's 5 megawatts of missing supply in order to solve the supply-demand balance, and the power balance constraint surplus variable will take a value of 5 to show the market, or to be able to essentially solve the constraint in the market without the market problem just defaulting to no solution. And so then that 5 megawatts that's solved in the scheduling run gets passed to the pricing run and fixed within a small range. And the reason why that's important is that if the surplus variable was fixed in the pricing run, the penalty value associated with that surplus variable would not be able to be price setting. And so what the market optimization does is fixes the value, let's say in the example, the value is 5, and creates a small band of movement around that number so that it can support sort of an incremental change in that value, and therefore the price is reflected in the pricing run. So penalty prices in the pricing run determine the binding prices that are published to the market. And so one way to think about the scheduling run is its function is to determine the surplus, if there are any surplus variables that are activated based on the scheduling run priorities. And if they are passed to the pricing run, and the pricing run calculates the prices associated with those constraint violations. So that's a lot of information about surplus variables, but it's necessary to understand the upcoming examples. So if any of that is confusing, maybe I'll take a quick pause to see if there's any clarifying questions I can answer. Okay, let's go to slide 14. Okay, so now that we understand the concept of what a surplus variable is and what it does and how it relates to pricing, we can start talking about each of the 4 scarcity pricing elements and their market mechanics. So we'll start with reserve shortage pricing. So reserve shortage pricing is a generic term. CAISO's term for this in our BPMs and tariff is the scarcity reserve demand curve. So the scarcity reserve demand curve applies during periods in which there's insufficient supply to meet the minimum procurement requirements for ancillary services. And so the market already does have this concept of ancillary service scarcity that's effectuated by this scarcity reserve demand curve. So when there is insufficient supply to meet any of the CAISO's AS requirements within a specific AS region or subregion, the scarcity reserve demand curve clears the AS market with administratively determined prices. So just same as the concept we've been discussing, what the market optimization actually sees is that one of the surplus variables associated with these AS requirements takes value in the scheduling run because there's not sufficient supply to meet that requirement, and it gets passed into the pricing run, and the pricing run uses these administratively determined prices to set the AS scarcity value. Let's go to the next slide. So here is the AS or scarcity reserve demand curve. This is taken out of the CAISO's Business Practice Manual for Market Operations, page 181, assuming that version 79 is still the current one. You can also find the same table in the CAISO tariff section 27.1.2.3.5. So let's talk a little bit about this table to make sure that I can help you interpret it correctly. So in the rows of the table, you have various reserves. You have regulation up, spinning reserve, non-spinning reserve, and regulation down. And you can see in the non-spinning reserve category, you actually have different values for different degrees of shortage. For example, the bottom-most portion of the curve says that when there is a shortage of less than 70 megawatts, some value applies. And then a shortage of between 70 and 210, and then a shortage of over 210. So those are different severities of shortage for non-spinning reserve that reflect certain value. Now, the columns of the table represent the penalty prices associated with them. And so if you look at the column that says percent of max energy bid price, so essentially the lowest most shortage for less than 70 megawatts of non-spinning reserve comes at a penalty price of 50% of the relevant bid price cap at that time. So if you were to follow that row all the way to the right-hand side, in which case the max energy bid price is $1,000, you would see that the shortage price for the first step of non-spin is $500. That means that if the market needs to relax the non-spin requirement based on the scheduling priorities, it would result in a pricing run value of $500, and that's what the surplus variable would cost in that case. And as you move up the curve, or as you move up the table, from there, the incremental cost of shortages increase. Now notice one peculiar thing to notice in the non-spin row, all of the prices are increasing as you move up. And then you'll notice when you get to spinning reserve, it's now 10% or $100 for a $1,000 bid price. And the reason that happens is because our ancillary service procurement is cascading, meaning that spinning reserve can actually can actually meet your requirement for non-spin. And so what that means is that the numbers for spinning reserve and for regulation up are actually incremental to the non-spin values. So instead of interpreting the spinning reserve shortage price to be $1,000 or $100, it would actually be $100 plus $700 because in order to relax the full or some portion of the spinning reserve, you must have relaxed all of the non-spin requirement as well. So they're incremental. So basically what that means is that if you start to relax your regulation up requirements, the penalty value associated with that is $700 for the non-spin, plus $100 for the spin, plus $200 for the reg up, or $1,000. And then those are scaled based on the relevant energy bid price at the time. So if FERC Order 831 conditions applied and we're now at a bid price or a penalty, we're working on $2,000 penalty prices now, essentially those values would double. So they scale accordingly to that value. And then finally, for regulation down, it's the same concept where the higher the regulation down shortage that occurs under various steps, the more the penalty price the market will pay to resolve that constraint for reg down. Question in the queue.
Absolutely. Let's go ahead and unmute Michaela.
Hello, I'm assuming that's me. It's Michaela Feig with Customized Energy Solutions. I was wondering if you could just provide a little background on how the ISO landed on these values, whether or not there's any analysis that went into determining these penalty prices.
By values, do you mean the penalty prices or the shortage quantities?
Both.
Well, starting with shortage quantities, I'm not sure. That's a good question. I'll have to go back and look at when this scarcity reserve demand curve was implemented and filed. I'm sure there was some deliberation on the size of those steps and what it means. I would guess that it's probably, I'm just speculating, but I would guess it's probably based on the, the relevant size of historical non-spin requirements. But we can go back and look and report back to the working group what we find. Now for the prices, it's a little different. I mean, all of the ISOs, and we'll see this on, I think actually on the next slide, have different or varying penalty values associated with its AS shortage values. And I think there are some principles that you could use to decide whether or not those values are appropriate. I know at least one commenter in the working groups has said, well, maybe it makes sense to have the shortage price for non-spin be the same price as the power balance constraint price. So that means that the shortage value below 70 megawatts, which is now 500, would be 1,000, under the assumption that, well, if those are NERC required minimums that you must hold even above energy, then if you had a shortage of capacity and you had to trade off between the two, maybe they hold the same value. All that's to say is that it's more of an art than a science, I think, in determining what these steps are and the dollar values, but I think there's sort of a way to feel whether or not the values seem appropriate. Does that help, or do you have any suggestions about other ways to think about it? Michaela became unmuted.
Go ahead and unmute Michaela again.
Sorry about that. Yeah. Well, yeah, I was just wondering about those principles, because I'm a little more familiar with some of the other RTO's scarcity pricing mechanisms, and the set of principles that they use for establishing like the penalty price for the power balance constraint, and then each of the relative reserves and the level of shortages there. So I didn't know if there was like one set of principles that CAISO used when establishing these. And I imagine that in this reform effort, you'll put together principles for, whether or not you want to modify any of them. I just didn't know if you were operating off of a set of principles already.
Yeah, so we'll make it a point to sort of collect back any history of this curve that's relevant to answering those questions, report it back to the working group. And yeah, the next slide, I think, will show some of the relative differences in the AS curve, so to speak, And again, I think I do think it's a bit more of an art than a science, and the values, there's some principles to help guide you to what the right values are, but there's no, maybe like one theoretically correct set of numbers to choose. I think we can define sort of bounds and reasonable expectations about what these prices should be given principles, but maybe not like one unique set of numbers. I hope that helps. JK?
All right.
Hey, James, thank you for presenting this. I have some basic questions. Hopefully you don't mind. My first question is, this only apply to the day ahead market, right? And to KAISO BA.
It does only apply to KAISO BA. It applies both in the day ahead market and in real time, although in day ahead, my understanding is the scheduling priority for the AS requirements are higher than the power balance constraint violation. And so my understanding is that the day ahead market will pretty much never go short on these requirements. Now, in real time, these do trigger in real time. We can talk a little bit about that. And in real time, my understanding is the scheduling priority for these products is less than the power balance constraint penalty price in real time, which is why they do sort of pop up. So all to say, this curve is more applicable in the real time market for sure.
Okay, I must have misunderstood. I thought the ancillary services are not re-optimized in real time market, but it sounds like they are.
You're right. They're not re-optimized in real time, but if incremental quantities are needed, we will re-procure the incremental amount. And so let's say, for example, you're going into a real-time market, a certain FMM run, and a unit that was holding 250 megawatts of non-spin goes on outage all of a sudden. And the market cannot recover. The market would then look in that FMM interval to procure and replace the 250 megawatts. And if it can't find replacement for that 250 megawatts, it would activate this these prices.
Okay, so to repeat what you just said, this is more likely to be activated in real-time market, and it's only applied to the incremental procurement amount of ancillary service.
Yeah. Now, of course, that is the way it works today. We are questioning, in the long run, the idea of only procuring incremental quantities of AS in real time. Many of the other ISO RTO markets completely re-optimize contingency reserve and regulating reserves in real time. And we have various operational reasons that prevented us from doing that. But so I just want to confirm that, yes, that is true for today's market, but part of the discussion is to be, well, if we were to completely re-optimize AS, you might trigger these in a slightly different way.
Yeah, I think you just touched the point I was going to ask next, because this is, as you said, this will only apply to the KAISO BAA, and there are different, different ways of procurement of ancillary service and requirements in the other BAAs, right? And we will, now today we have WEIM, in the future there's also EDAM. We haven't discussed the attention of applying scarcity pricing for energy in which of this markets yet, but considering there is an interaction, because this is looking at the insufficiency of the supply as well, there will be a symmetry in design the scarcity pricing for energy. So I guess this is a long shot, but just something to be aware of. The the procurement of ancillary service, presenting a market design asymmetry in extended market.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. One way to think about it is, so this scarcity reserve demand curve existed, I think before the EIM started, certainly before EDAM, and independent of the regional market, the CAISO, it's a CAISO balancing area where the only market participant would still have and would still find useful, I think, a scarcity reserve demand curve for its own AS. And the question now becomes, well, if CAISO is designing scarcity pricing that is centered around this sort of concept of reserve shortage pricing, and you don't have AS procurement in other regions, does that sort of make the scarcity pricing you're trying to effectuate ineffective outside of the CAISO, and maybe, as you point out, asymmetric in terms of its impact? So
Exactly.
definitely something to think about.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like, we'll probably first relax our ancillary service requirement before, the other BAs does, or they do it before us. Yeah.
Yep, that makes sense.
Thanks, JK. Let's go ahead and go to John from SRP, please.
Yeah, I was just wondering, do we have a separate report or some indication on the various reports that we have for settlements or anything to let us know that scarcity load and scarcity pricing was applied for ancillaries and in general? I mean, other than just us looking for a place where the price is at $2,000 a megawatt hour?
Yeah, great question. So my understanding is FERC requires us to report on that. And I think I have to go back and look at what frequency that's done. I have a feeling that it's done on an every 3-year basis. So basically, the CAISO puts out a report every 3 years to report on the frequency of AS shortage events that had happened and why they happened and in what intervals. And there may also be like some sub-reporting based on that, where, something in my mind is telling me that maybe you could find that on a monthly basis. But follow up with us and we'll make sure if you're looking for that sort of information, or maybe in the discussion paper, some way, Juan, we can make that as a reference, because I definitely look at those, and we'll point out to folks where those are being recorded.
Yeah, that's a great idea, James. We'll be sure to add that.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, John. Okay, so let's move to slide 16. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Just teeing up, we presented this, well, it's hard to say that I presented this slide to the MSC because MSC member Hobbs is actually an author of this paper, which I stole this figure from. So, and I think it'd be a little disingenuous to say we presented it to them. But anyway, the link to the academic paper that this figure comes from is down at the bottom there. And essentially what the paper was trying to do is to, in the best way it could, make the different ISO RTO reserve shortage curves sort of match up and line up to each other. And we talked about this at the MSC at length, but let's talk about it a little more here. So the first way to understand what this curve is doing is that as you move to the right on your screen, more and more reserves are available. And as you move to the left, fewer reserves are available. And as you can see, there's downward sloping curves to indicate that as reserve shortages worsen, the value or penalty value associated with those shortages grows. And that's not a unique concept to the CAISO. That's why we posted, so our sort of that descending scarcity curve is not unique. Now they have a lot of different shapes. And I'll note that CAISO's, just in case you're curious, CAISO's is the yellow curve, that shows up kind of near the bottom of these segments of curves. But it's not, it does need to be noted that if the CAISO were in FERC Order 831 conditions, it would sort of put us more near the middle of the curve, where the $1,000 segment would then move to $2,000 segment. So that would put us slightly higher than SPP's highest value and a little bit higher than, I believe that's PJM and the Brown. So what these various steps show, so the steps from the table I showed are actually all on here. So the $1,000 curve for CAISO is here. Then the 900 for spin, or actually it might be 800. 800 for spin, 700 for the highest non-spin shortage, and 600 and 500. And then we sort of drop off to this vertical line at 3. So I want to point out another way of looking at this figure is that I want everyone to sort of draw an imaginary line, imaginary vertical line at the 3 gigawatt level. And you can kind of see that all of the ISO RTOs, you know, their curves sort of are vertical at that point. And that's the point where the authors basically say, okay, everything to the left of that curve is our NERC required reserves. So you're required to be holding this quantity of reserves, you know, by NERC requirements. And everything to the right of the curve are sort of extra reserves that are held for various reasons. And so for the CAISO, it's kind of hard to see here, but you can kind of see this trickling down yellow line that's downward sloping, kind of in between 3 and 4. And that's intended to represent our flexible ramping product demand curve. And I'll talk a little bit about that on slide 17. But I do want to point out, so we had some discussion earlier about scarcity pricing during an actual shortage and scarcity pricing leading up to a shortage. If you're curious about the latter, which is leading up to a shortage, you want to be looking at values to the right of 3 megawatts. And so what we talked about at the Market Surveillance Committee meeting is that, you know, a lot of other ISOs have 30-minute reserve type products that are, you can think of them as replacement reserves or other types of reserves that sort of supplement their contingency and operating reserves. And then CAISO doesn't have those. And I'm not necessarily saying that we need to get 30-minute reserves, but all I'm pointing out is that there may be ways to sort of extend the right tail of this graph in order to get the price response we're looking for, and that many of the other ISOs do, is to signal impending shortages in advance of the actual shortage. And that, I think that's really important. Trying to think if there's anything else I want to say on this chart. Maybe I'll pause here if anybody has any questions about the chart and how to read it. We'll start with JK.
Thank you, James, for review this graph again. I do have a quick question. So just to clarify, I think it's noted on the label as well. This is the price for reserves, not for energy, right?
That's right. These are reserve shortage prices. Yep. Okay.
And when the CAISO, when we discuss the scarcity pricing here, as the topic, it's really we want to design a scarcity pricing for energy.
So that's a good comment, and I anticipated that question. And the example that I have put together, I think, will demonstrate why they're commingled. And essentially, it's that the ancillary service shortage pricing sort of has an effect on the energy price through the co-optimization. And so you can sort of get both energy scarcity pricing through the AS shortage curves, which is the most common method of doing it among the markets.
Okay, I think I understand what you're saying, but let me try to say it again and see if we're on the same page. So I fully agree with you that design of the reserve shortage pricing, it has an interaction with the energy and it will affect the energy price. But is CAISO's intention just to revise or maybe adding a new mechanism for the reserve shortage pricing, where you will have a separate design for energy, separate design for energy shortage pricing directly?
So I think that's all on the table. However, it seems that there can be improvements made. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the second half of our workshop today in terms of problem statements. That improvements can be made to the AS or the reserve shortage pricing. I shouldn't call it AS shortage pricing, because the reserves that you're seeing here on the screen they can include FlexiRAM products, they can include 30-minute reserves, and those aren't traditionally considered, your AS products. So now, are there ways to effectuate scarcity pricing through the energy price alone without looking at the AS reserves? Yes, there probably are, and we can talk about those, but it's the most common mechanism for markets to be looking at applying scarcity pricing through the AS or the reserve shortage curves. So it's sort of the most obvious way of making change into our market. So I hope that helps.
It does. It does. Yeah. So I'm not saying that we should design a energy pricing, energy shortage pricing, separately. Just want to clarify, because that's what I thought. And like first time when I look at the topics was like, there is a ancillary service scarcity pricing. Of course, it's not as complete, but I thought CAISO's intention was to establish another mechanism on top of it. And, for like, even you design a shortage pricing for energy only, you cannot ignore the interaction with other products in the market. But I guess what you just said is that CAISO want to design a scarcity pricing through the mechanism of reflecting the shortage of reserves, and this reserve will be inclusive of all reserves in the market, not just the ancillary service, but other products such as imbalance products and FlexRAM products in real time. Is that right?
Yeah,
okay.
I think that's fair. Now I'll just say, so I'm not going to presume a solution, of course, at this stage, but I think I think the context of what you're saying is correct in this discussion, and is that we are not necessarily looking for a new a mechanism on top of the existing one. I think that we're more so looking at improvements to be made to the existing one.
Okay.
Yeah, I hope that helps.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, JK.
Let's go to Kyle at Cal Advocates, please.
I have a little question about the. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Apologies. Go ahead.
All right. Sorry. Where was I? Yeah. So I have a question about the asterisks on the slide here. That the CAISO curve would be doubled in height during FERC Order 831 conditions. Does that caveat also apply to the other ISO curves here as well?
It's a good question. I'm fairly confident the answer is no, and the reason I say that is because that is a caveat that is stated in this academic paper, and I would trust that Ben and his co-authors did their due diligence. What I am trying to find out, I think would be useful to the working group, is what. So these are reserve shortage prices, but what it doesn't tell you necessarily is the power balance constraint penalty price, which I guess for CAISO it doubles during FERC Order 831 conditions. Now, all of the other ISOs, excluding ERCOT, ERCOT is in this figure, but they're not FERC jurisdictional. They all use FERC Order 831 conditions on bidding. All of them do. So all of them have, you're able to bid up to 2,000 under certain conditions. They might have slightly different implementations of things like bid, non-resource specific cost verification and things like that. But they all use that for bidding. But I think that CAISO is unique in that FERC Order 831 conditions actually double our penalty price. So I hope that helps as a half answer to your question, and maybe we can look into getting more detail about that in a future working group.
Yeah, it does help. I guess the kind of second question I have then is, would it be a more accurate, like apples to apples visualization then in this instance if CAISO's line were doubled?
Yes. Yeah, most likely, because I would presume that most of the time reserve shortage pricing kicks in. Well, actually, let me take that back. There's kind of, so reserve shortage pricing does kick in times where there's not emergencies. And that can cause the price of whatever reserve to hit the shortage price, even though you're not in tight system conditions. Because there's really a variety of ways. So the example I gave to JK earlier is you had a resource go on outage and that was providing a lot of a certain reserve, and the market wasn't able to recover that reserves in time, and that could happen at any time, right? Regardless of the level of load. Now, reserve shortage pricing is more likely, all else equal, to kick in during periods of higher load. And it is also well, if you look at these AS shortage reports, a lot of time there's a category there that says, you know, sort of insufficient supply to meet the requirements generally. And that's intended to mean, you know, when you're in like really tight system conditions, like true scarcity. And that does happen, but I would say, at least for the last couple of years, most of the AS shortages tend to be sort of transient. So to get back to your question, I would say yes and no. That if we were under the assumption that it was a scarcity event, then yes, probably doubling the values makes this more representative. But generally speaking, the likelihood that an AS shortage event will occur generally, you know, may be more likely to, or I don't know about more likely, but just as likely to happen under the $1,000 penalty values too. So I was kind of thinking out loud there. If you want me to re-summarize what I said, I will, but does that help?
That's fine. Yeah, I think you covered it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate the question.
We have one more question.
Yeah,
just
go ahead and
there. Yep.
Hey, James, it's Perry Servideo, CISA. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Hey, I just wanted to ask if you've put any thought into the interactive effects between the scheduling run penalty prices and the pricing run penalty prices. We've noted that there's kind of a small issue with the way that the scheduling run prices the shortage of energy prior to having the reserve shortage penalties kick in. And I'm just wondering if that's like been resolved behind the scenes, or if that's kind of part of this also. What this gets to is having a nice sort of smooth approaching curve for shortages, rather than this disjointed jumping of prices up and down as you move through the various penalty price steps.
Yeah, the disjointedness is definitely an issue. Although you can, other than ERCOT, there's really not a lot of smoothness to these curves generally, and there's some implementation ease about having sort of these fixed blocks, although the spikiness in pricing is not desirable sometimes. But so in terms of your first question, so we can follow up on this, but go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I was just to be more pointed out. I'll just looking at the curve here. I would even call, even though they're blocky, I would even call these are a curve that moves you up to $1,000 penalty price. It is a curve. What I'm talking about isn't reflected in this chart, because this is strictly based on the pricing run penalty prices. But
Right.
in actual reality, what's going on is there's a scheduling run that has different penalty prices than these. And the issue I'm talking about is that the market's scheduling run will always forego energy up until a certain point, after which it'll begin to forego the reserves. And that's just it just has to do with the first step of the power balance constraint violation. And they put a little buffer in there for the quantity of seasonal regulation requirement. So what you would actually get if you're looking at this in real life is that the prices may jump to 1,000 up until a certain point, and then crater back to 500 to show the shortage in the reserves. So that sort of disjointedness, when you would imagine, no, I've gone even more short. This should continue to the penalty prices should continue to increase. That might be a little too in depth for this call, but it's worth noting here, because this curve looks fairly, easy to understand and whatnot, but it's not actually what would occur at the given shortage range.
Yeah, so you're basically saying they'll be even jumpier than it might look from this curve, because if you're sort of bypassing the scheduling run, sort of bypasses the AS shortage in the first place, you're going to go right to power balance constraint violations, in which case your prices are going to rise to the top and then maybe fall just as fast as they rose, and
then continue to rise again. Yeah, so it just gets, maybe we'll get to it in the problem statements, but it seems like a good design would be one in which we have a clear sort of increasing price as the issue gets worse and worse.
Yeah, so I would say that, and we'll talk about this in the problem statement one, but you're sort of hitting on, I think, our main two problem statements, one of which is that various things in our market prevent this curve, or this type of curve, from being effective, and possibly scheduling priority. Scheduling priority is one of them.
Yep.
And all things. And the second thing is that on top of the existing curves that we have, which are the scarcity reserve demand curve that I showed, and the FRP demand curve that I'll talk about in a second, there's not a whole lot of right tail to this curve, meaning that there's, at the moment, limited opportunities for the market to signal in advance of the NERC required minimums that an impending shortage is happening. And debatably, FRP in itself is not, FRP is ramping capacity, and debatably that's not even a perfect signal for scarcity of just generic capacity, right? So I think you're hitting on basically our two main problem statements.
Okay. Well, okay, then I'll save it for that portion then. Sorry for that.
No, that's okay. Thanks for that. All right, so let's go to slide 17. Thanks everyone for the comments and questions. Okay, so just a time check. Okay, so this is a quick and dirty numerical example to get us to understand sort of how reserve shortage pricing is effectuates through to the energy price through co-optimization. So what we have here is a simple two generator, one load system, all connected, so there's no transmission constraints or anything like that. Both of the resources are 100 megawatt units, and they are serving a 150 megawatt demand in this case. And also assume that there is an AS or some sort of reserve requirement for 40 megawatts. So if you sum up the two units, they have enough capacity to meet the sum of the demand and the AS requirement here. Now the resource on the left is a little bit cheaper for energy, so you can see that its energy bid is 100 megawatts at $30, whereas the unit on the right is 100 megawatts at $35. So just to create a little bit of price separation here. And they're bidding to provide this generic AS product, 30 megawatts a piece at $10. So let's go to the next slide. So we won't spend too much time on this, but if you were to solve for the optimal dispatch here and the resulting prices, you would get 90 megawatts. If on the lower left corner there, you can see the schedules. In the lower right corner, the schedule for unit or resource B. You'd get 90 megawatts out of the cheaper unit and 60 megawatts of energy out of the more expensive unit. And because neither of the resources has enough AS offers to solve the total AS requirement, you need a little bit of ancillary service awards on resource A. So it sort of prevents resource A from getting a full energy schedule in this case. Now, the resulting prices, so for energy, the resulting price in this case is $35 because if you needed an incremental unit of energy, you would get it from resource B at a cost of $35. Now, the curious thing here is that the AS marginal price is $15, even though the ancillary service offers from both of these units are 10. So let's zero in on that concept and figure out what's going on here. So what's happening is that because resource A is needed to provide reserves in order to meet the total reserve requirement of 40 megawatts, the market must give it a 10 megawatt reserve award because it can only get 30 megawatts from resource B. And that means that it's prevented from producing an extra 10 megawatts of energy where its bid costs are $30 and the relevant LMP is 35. So it has a $5 per unit opportunity cost of being prevented from providing energy and has to provide reserves instead. So what the market clearing process does is it automatically incorporates that opportunity cost into the AS marginal price. So it's the $10 bidding cost plus the $5 opportunity cost of not being able to provide energy. So what the simple example is intended to demonstrate is that when you co-optimize products, their prices are also sort of merged together, not merged together, but they're in a way dependent on each other. So let's go into the next slide. So now how I'm changing the example is I'm taking resource B, look at the right side of the screen, and I've changed its energy. It's derated. It's on a partial outage. It was now only able to provide 60 megawatts. Okay, so now what's happening is that the sum of the two resource capacity, which is 100 plus 60, 160, is not sufficient to meet the sum of the demand and AS requirements, which is 190. So the market's going to squeeze all it can out of these two resources in order to provide the energy and the reserves. And that at the bottom, an AS surplus variable is going to kick in. So that's where the market says, okay, well, I'm not able to meet my AS requirement, and I'm going to trigger this AS surplus variable to take a value that reflects the missing quantity that I need. So that quantity is 30 megawatts because the sum of these two units is 30 megawatts short of meeting the requirement. Now, as we learned in the beginning slides, whenever you have a surplus variable that takes value, its penalty price is part of the objective function. And at the very top, I have in bold assume a reserve violation penalty price of $500 in this case. So that means that for this 30 megawatts AS surplus variable, it comes out of a penalty cost of $500 per unit. Okay, so now let's talk about the prices. So the energy and the AS prices have gone up significantly in this example. And then the AS price of $500 is intuitive because that's the penalty price of the AS surplus variable. So we won't spend so much time on that. But why has the energy price gone up so much? And that is what I'm trying to focus on in this example. Let's focus on resource A. So resource A is needed to produce 100 megawatts of energy and produces 0 megawatts of reserve, and is asked to provide 0 megawatts of reserve. Now, the problem is that that unit, resource A, had bid $10 to provide AS, and it's facing a AS marginal price of $500. That means that if the unit was able to provide reserves, it would make $490 of profit per unit to sell reserve. So the market is really smart and says, okay, well, because we want resource A to be indifferent between the schedules that we give them, the marginal price of energy has to reflect the opportunity cost for resource A not to provide reserves. So in this case, the energy marginal clearing price is the sum of the marginal bid for energy, which is resource B's $35 bid, plus the $490 opportunity cost of resource A to not sell reserves, and that equals $525. So a very similar to the simple example before, but basically shows that through reserve shortage pricing, you are able to also reflect that shortage into the energy price as well. Let's go to the next slide. So a summary of that concept: the market optimization ensures the awards that they give to resources are allocated in such a way that the resulting prices makes these two resources indifferent between providing energy or providing reserves based on their bid costs. And that's done automatically in the market. That's just the way it mathematically works out. So again, the punchline is, in the previous example, the energy price needs to be at least $490 higher than the energy bid of the marginal unit in order to make resource A indifferent between selling energy and reserves. Let me pause here to see if there's any clarifying questions I can provide on these examples. Okay.
James, I'm not seeing any.
All right. Thank you very much. Let's move to the next slide. So I just want to mention, I'm not going into great detail about the FRP demand curve here, but I do want to note that the FRP procurement demand curve does contribute to scarcity pricing signals in the real-time market to the extent that the demand curve is kicking in. It creates this exact same sort of opportunity cost logic to the energy price, just like AS. In the example, it was an AS product, but it could be FRP too. And the mechanisms in terms of how the price relationships work out are pretty much exactly the same. Now, as to the comment, Perry and I were talking about, debatably flexible ramping product is sort of a limited subset of the total capacity. And so it's not a perfect substitute, I would say, for scarcity pricing of reserves, because it only applies to, a subset of the capacity that might be available for ramp at any given time. But it certainly helps. And other markets that have flexi ramp type products have demand curves that work in the exact same way. So it's no different there. Question?
Yeah, let's go ahead and unmute JK.
Hi, James. If you answer my question before, I apologize. But after your presented example, and then since you mentioned demand curve, I just want to clarify again. If we were to design a scarcity pricing, is the intention to replace the existing, or like just reestablish and that scarcity pricing will be replacing the demand curve and the ancillary service scarcity pricing. So you will not have that table and the demand curve for FRP again in real time, but instead it will have integrated scarcity pricing.
So I think that you would continue to have, because the way that the reserves are procured, so for example, your AS requirements and your FRP requirements are not dependent on each other, right? They're completely independent. And the procurement of one reserve is completely independent of another. So I think no matter what, unless that fact changes, which I don't think it will, I think you'll still have separation between what we'll call generically an AS demand curve and an FRP demand curve. Now, what could be updated potentially is the shape of those curves relative to each other. So could we go back to the slide with the chart? I think it might have been 16 or 17. Just to make my point.
Yeah, that would be slide 16, please.
Thank you. So it is kind of hard to see in this figure, and I apologize for that because there's a lot of stuff bundled there on the lower side here. But if you were to isolate the yellow curve, which is the CAISOs, you would basically see sort of a drop off here at 3 gigawatts from the $500 curve that starts the non-spin demand curve down to 247, which is the beginning of the FRP demand curve. And what really matters, I guess, is the relationship of those curves to each other. And we can discuss whether or not the existing relationship is effective and efficient, or if some other relationship would be preferred.
Okay. Okay, and in the day-ahead market, that will be, I assume, if the scarcity pricing, it maybe one step back, the scarcity pricing, I assume it will only happen in a real-time market, right?
So I think for reasons the reasons I've said, that tends to be true, and I think Perry's comment is well taken in the sense that maybe we should be reconsidering whether or not they should be applying equally across the markets by looking at their scheduling priority, which my understanding is the same as Perry's, that they're not the same between markets. So the answer to your question is yes, today, scarcity pricing is primarily, in terms of like AS shortages, are primarily a real-time market function.
Okay, that's really helpful.
But I think where you were going is to say, like, well, in the day-ahead market, you have something similar to this, but then you have the imbalance reserve demand curve, which is different than the FRP demand curve. And I think that part of the discussion is also to say, is the relationship between the imbalance reserve demand curve and the AS demand curves that hopefully can be made more effective in day ahead, is their relationship efficient and effective? Does it make sense? And if it doesn't, let's talk about it. So that's kind of, I think that's where you were going, right?
I didn't intend to go there yet. I mean, like, I think, applying it to do a real-time market and not considering day-ahead market is a smart move for now. And yeah, I think you answered my questions. Basically, having a scarcity pricing is, if you consider total reserve, that will be in real time the FRP plus the AS. But given whatever the market is procuring for now, then the scope will be the incremental procurement target of the AS and the FRP, and then integrately considering how to form the shape of demand curve in order to to give the scarcity pricing signal. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay.
That's exactly right.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. So let's move back to slide. I think I left off on slide 21, and then we'll ask Steve his question.
Yeah, hi, this is Steve Keene from Edison. Yeah, and the one showing the example, the last one, where you were calculating the energy price and you're basing it on the opportunity cost. The, I guess I'm a little concerned that, essentially that resource is going to get the opportunity, that opportunity cost that you're calculating across all 100 megawatts of its energy, even though it doesn't have an opportunity cost across all 100 megawatts of its energy. And
yeah, I mean that. Yeah, sorry.
I'm trying to work through in my brain. I mean, I understand the marginal concepts and stuff, but it does seem like we're essentially overpaying that generator. Because his opportunity costs aren't 52,500. They're only, what is it, 15,750. Is that?
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. You're basically saying that they only had an opportunity to provide some segment of their capacity for that product, but they're getting paid the market clearing price for basically their entire capacity, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's, that's how the math sort of shakes out, but, and to be clear, like that specific example, like if you think about the example I provided, even before the $500 kicked in, I mean, the same concept applied in that situation too. So it's just, anytime there's sort of co-optimization of multiple products, you're going to have this sort of mathematical effect that the prices are going to reflect opportunity cost. And the basic principle being that you want to make sure that when the market gives awards to resources, they have the incentive to follow the instructions, and the prices are the mechanism to which you incentivize that type of behavior. So,
okay. Yeah, I mean, I said, I'm still thinking through what the implications of that are. And, especially as you move from this very simplified example to to what would be going on in the market in one of these situations. But I just wanted to see if you, I guess, to see if anyone else had noticed this and, could explain. I understand, the marginal concepts and stuff, but it just seems a little, I don't know, I'm troubled by it a little bit here, put it that way. I have to think through it some more to think what the implications are, but yeah. I just wanted to raise that. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve.
And if we could, I know that we're not necessarily in the stakeholder discussion, but I would be curious to hear if any other stakeholders had a reaction to that. We did get something in the chat here, and this is kind of what's spurring it on. To the extent that this resource serves energy that enables a different resource to provide the AS, this seems like the right signal. So, if there is anyone who would like to kind of weigh in on this portion of the conversation, and I know we need to get through the rest of your slides, James, but I wanted to provide that opportunity.
Yeah, we'll have folks think about it, and if anybody wants to chime in, we can hear from them.
I am thinking about your comment from the very beginning when we were talking about must offer obligations. And I think this is a nice example of how the reserve violation penalty price applies to that unit that we want to be providing the AS, but it's not like a full administratively scarcity price signal that applies to the whole market. The incentives for the rest of the resources in the supply stack still remain to bid at marginal price. And this is a very targeted way of incentivizing delivery. It applies to that resource, but when demand goes down, we go back to our regularly priced supply. Does that help?
Thank you. Thank you for that, Sylvie. Yeah. Yeah, I think, yep. James, and we'll have ample opportunity to kind of go on. So please, James, please continue. My apologies there.
All right, slide 22. I am nearing the end of the material. Actually, nope, that material was just one element of scarcity pricing, which is the reserve shortage pricing. Luckily, there's fewer slides on these ones. Before I do, it looks like Don has a question or comment before I go on.
Don Trethewey from CISA. I'll take an attempt, I think, to try to explain some of this. If you think about what the CAISO is currently implemented with regards to scarcity pricing, there isn't a scarcity pricing mechanism for energy. So we do have a scarcity pricing mechanism for ramp, which is the flexible ramping demand curve. And to the extent that is triggered, then you see the resulting impact to the energy price from the co-optimization. Okay, so then we also have an AS scarcity approach. Oh, and I would note that you could be insufficient ramp and have plenty of capacity. So likewise, you have an AS scarcity paradigm where to the extent that you can't meet your AS requirement, that you'll relax at certain penalty prices, and that then will be reflected in the energy price in the event that through the co-optimization, the fact that you're short ancillary services. But you could be short ancillary services and have plenty of energy capacity because you simply ran out of AS bids. But what's missing is there's not an energy scarcity demand curve. You basically reach the penalty price of the power balance constraint violation, and then that starts to roll into all of the other ancillary services or ramp products through the co-optimization. But you need to actually have a distinct, just like you have a distinct ramp shortage mechanism, a AS shortage mechanism, you need an energy shortage mechanism so that you can get the price signals right and start to gradually communicate to the market that the CAISO is getting short on energy capacity and is willing to pay above the marginal cost of supply in order to incent more energy bids coming in. The ramp and the AS are already there to try to incentivize more AS bids, but you don't have the incentive for more just regular old energy bids.
Thanks, Don. That's interesting because that's JK sort of asked the question earlier about whether or not we need an additional mechanism or to look at changing the existing ones. And you're essentially saying, yes, we have our AS curves, we have our FRP curve, and now we need something additional on top of that right?
Correct.
Yep. Okay.
I'll just add. Can I just add? There's some unique instances. That you could argue: is there really anybody that could provide, basically what I said, where I said, like, you could not meet your AS requirement, but have plenty of energy capacity. And I think you could see someone argue, well, how could you have AS scarcity before, absent running out of AS bids, to where you wouldn't need energy? And I would note that there are instances where there are certain resources, a few of them, where they only provide, for instance, regulation. So you could theoretically have enough regulation and actually have insufficient amount of energy bids. And that's the regulation energy management product. So in theory, it could happen. It'd be a pretty rare case, but that's why I think you need all three independently.
Interesting. Okay.
All right, let's go ahead and go to JK, please.
Yeah, I just want to follow on what Don just said. This was a very interesting discussion because I thought James already answered my question and then Don raised it again. So I probably have misunderstood the table presented. I thought the price of energy and the ancillary service has been interacting with each other because in a table there shows when you will have different administrative set ancillary service price regarding to what energy price. So I thought, the way the slack variable is designed is basically there's a coupling between the relaxation of the of the procurement requirement of the ancillary service to the energy balance, the power balance constraint, but it seems not. So maybe James, you can help us to understand the current design of ancillary service scarcity pricing. Does that impact? Does that will the change of or triggering any of the scarcity pricing reflected to the enterprise level as well, or it is only one way?
Can you ask the question again?
Yeah, so right. So when the ancillary service scarcity pricing is triggered, does that affect the energy price level as well, or it's only one way? So the way that I read the table is that they do interact with each other, but it seems like what Don said is it's both the energy price as well as the insufficiency of the capacity determines the scarcity pricing level of the ancillary service.
So I think there's two points here. In today's mechanism, the ancillary service shortage or scarcity price affects the energy price only through the mechanism that I explained in the example. So there's not like, as a result of co-optimization, there can be opportunity costs that reflect energy prices rising above the marginal resources offer. There's not any more direct link to the energy price than that. Then there's a second point, which is that the curves themselves are scaled based on the power balance constraint violation price, but they trigger independently, if that makes sense. So you could have the power balance constraint be violated in the AS scarcity demand curves not be violated, and vice versa.
Okay, that sounds a little confusing because the example we presented seems not aligned with the mechanism that we just described. One way to think about this is basically the way the slack variable that kicks in is you can consider it as it's a price of a marginal unit, right? So if you only have the demand curve for ancillary service, assume that's the only reserve available in the market, then if that has the slack variable, so that will set a marginal price of the ancillary service, but then that portion is completely decoupled from your power balance constraint. So your power balance constraint, that marginal unit will still be whatever units that's available in the market. It will not reflect the opportunity cost described in your example. So I wonder how, if the example is constructed based on a different mechanism that's already factored in how the two prices interact with each other, or is purely based on today's mechanism.
Yeah, you're making a really interesting point in it. Oh, sorry, there's feedback. Yeah, so basically what you're saying, and this is kind of what Don is saying, is that the triggering of the AS shortage, the AS demand curve does not guarantee a feedback to the energy price. That's true. And basically what you're saying is that you could have, and what Don was saying, you could just simply trigger the AS demand curve because there's not enough AS bids. And that has nothing to do with energy. And that's true. In those cases, it would not have an impact on the energy price. But in my example, there is shortage for both products, the sum of them. And in that case, any additional increment of capacity could help you either resolve, procure an additional unit of energy or procure an additional unit of ancillary service at the prevailing price. So in that case, there is a price interaction between the energy and the reserves that gets effectuated in the energy price. So it kind of
Yes and no. So what you're saying is exactly right, but I want to say the no part is that the first sentence said, you know, the having the shortage of reserves is not necessarily triggering a higher energy price. This is, I would say, this may not be exactly true, really depending on the situation. That's why, you know, when we show that chart have many curves of the other ISOs, right? They do have a higher energy price when their reserves running short. So it depends on how do you formulate the problem. You can still only have one demand curve for the reserves, but you still can impact energy. But the point is you need to make the two demand coupled with each other. So currently the CAISO's way of formulating the problem is you have the power balance constraint, that is your demand equals to supply, and then you have the ancillary service procurement target. The ancillary service bids equals to the requirement of procurement plus the slack variable. So that slack only serves directly to set a marginal price of the ancillary service. There's no coupling. Of course, it's still co-optimized, but in terms of shadow price, there's no coupling allowing that slack to set or reflecting to the price as a component to energy directly. So you can still have one curve, but the thing is you need to make the two demand coupled. Maybe you need another additional equation. Maybe you need to share that variable, if that makes sense.
Sort of. Maybe we can chat.
Maybe
we can chat
take it offline.
And
yeah, I think it's too down the ways.
But I appreciate generally the questions, and I think it's really important. And I sort of see, if I may sort of elaborate on sort of your comments and Don's comments, is that if you want even just improvements to the AS shortage curve do not guarantee that you're going to get the impact that you're looking for in the energy price. And there may be additional mechanisms that need to be there in place that if you're trying to make impacts on energy price, there's sort of gaps in the process, generally speaking.
Well, I think there are actually three different things we need to consider based on what you just described in order to make the policy reflect the example you just said. The first part is to the coupling between the scarcity of ancillary service procurement and the energy. Overall, it's a market scarcity, but now the formulation doesn't show the coupling is actually separate. In CAISO design, it seems like. That's the first part. You can still have the same mechanism, but the formulation may need to be altered a little bit. A mechanism, I'm saying, is basically, the demand curve as a mechanism. And the second part is considering the reserves that you want to relax. Is that only ancillary service, or want to consider other reserves, such as the demand curve, right? Such as flexible ramping products in the reserves. And the third part is if we were to apply it in an extended market in real time, the difference between the reserves and demand curves for each of the BAA, because for FRPs we procure it cross over the WEIM, but for ancillary service we only procure it for CAISO. So these are the three areas that I will probably look at in order for the policy to first align with the example you're showing. I think the examples are very good examples, and it shows how things are work. And for a quick feedback on the benefits of this, I think when we have multiple products in the market and multiple types of reserves, it is actually beneficial to consider the integration of all of these reserves when market is facing a scarcity. If you want to relax it, to what order, but you need to consider all of those reserves together.
I think those are all valuable comments, and I think I would generally agree that those are all good things to discuss.
So let's go ahead and let's go to Steve here, and then Robert, and then we can move on and we can continue on into the problem statement formulation. We've had a couple of comments here thus far in this review that I think feed very nicely into some of these problem statements that we want to discuss. So Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, Steve Keen from Edison. And this is kind of following up on what Don was saying, and then the questions and the discussion that you were having with JK. And I want to ask whether something's possible, and there's two, I'd like you to answer in two different ways. One is theoretically, is it possible? And the other is realistically, is it possible? And that is, can you have a situation where, an example you had on page 19, let's say, for example, this is showing that we're short of a combination of energy and ancillary services. But let's say we have the situation that Don was talking about where we're short of ancillary services, but we have sufficient energy. In that case, you trigger ancillary service pricing, the scarcity pricing. So you'd set that price at $500 in that example. But if there was sufficient energy, would the energy price stay where it was? And
yes.
And so theoretically, that's possible. The other question then is, realistically, is it possible, or do most generators provide both the same amounts of energy and ancillary services so that you would never get into that situation realistically?
That's an interesting question that would need some empirics behind it that I don't know. But I do think it would be valuable to present to the working groups more information about the conditions with which AS shortage violations happen, and give some actual examples about how reserve and energy prices moved based on the shortages and why they happened. So if that
Yeah,
would that satisfy sort of your curiosity?
I think so. And then I'd like to add one other thing to it, because in reality, we have at this point essentially three products. There's FRP and or maybe IRP. I'm treating them kind of similar. AS and then energy. And it would be interesting to see, you know, with the typical bids we get, when we see a shortage in AS or FRP, does it essentially automatically imply a shortage of overall energy, or can we have this type of situation where it's just a shortage of resources that can meet what, you know, that are willing to provide AS or FRP?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with FRP, it's difficult to distinguish because FRP and energy are almost sort of completely fungible, and so I don't think you would have the same ability to sort of couple out or decouple the energy and FRP prices, because you know, even so, FRP is not something that people bid, and it's a function of your energy bid anyway.
True.
But I think yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, but there are resources that can provide energy, but are essentially incapable of providing FRP.
Right.
Right. You mean like a nuke plant, for example. It's definitely providing energy, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not going to provide FRP. It's not going to move around.
And so you're saying, well, why? So if you're, let me try to say what you're saying. So if you're getting some sort of price response in the energy price due to, let's just say, an FRP shortage, is it appropriate to compensate the generators that aren't capable of providing FRP because they don't inherently have any sort of opportunity cost themselves between the two products? That's essentially what you're saying, right?
I'm thinking about a situation where, let's say that, you know, almost everything that's running at that point, it's the nuke plants and a bunch of solar that, you know, for various reasons, the solar has not put in bids for FRP because they're producing what they can. Nuclear, the same thing. You're having to buy FRP off of other resources. You know, is the energy price really tied? If there's a shortage of FRP, or for that matter, a shortage of AS, does that really impact the energy price?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it does. Yeah, I mean, it does to somebody. It does to somebody. But there's all these inframarginal now units that benefit from this opportunity cost coupling of the prices that, you know, never stood a chance of sort of receiving the product, even though they're getting the benefit of that opportunity cost through some other price. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think that's, you know, it's going back. We assumed, I think, that there was always a cascading of this stuff, that, you know, if you could provide energy, you could provide spinning reserves. If you could provide spinning reserves, you could provide non-spinning reserves, and like that. But that may not be true for all of the resources, especially some of the ones we're getting now, where they may be able to provide one of those products, but not others.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I mean, that, like you said, it may be worth looking at some of the, like, empirical data to see, you know, is this really a problem, or am I just basically making up something that's not really there.
Yeah, I think I have been thinking about this, and I think it would be worthwhile to dive into a couple of actual examples and to demonstrate the various reasons why these shortages happened, and then how they impacted the price of the relevant product and of energy as well. I think that would be really interesting.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Steve. We still have 3 hands here, but I do want to give us kind of a time check and ensure that we do have the ability to kind of get to that stakeholder discussion. And again, as James mentioned, we already have a list of a couple items of takeaways to kind of provide additional information and present that to the working group here. So real quick, let's go ahead and go to Robert Fisher, please.
This is Robert Fisher, NV Energy. I'll try to make this quick. I just wanted to kind of support or throw some support at what Don was saying. This discussion around AS is an important aspect, and it's more likely to occur in the integrated forward market, but in real time, because the procurement levels are set by the day ahead, the energy is going to be left alone without any type of price penalty mechanism. And when you're having EEA system shortages and there's no price differences between an EEA1 to an EEA2 to a 3, and pricing is still similar, I feel like there needs to be some kind of mechanism to help represent all these different types of situations and represent the scarcity in the system for that time frame. So having the AS is a nice aspect. And just one comment, the other markets, as I understand it, procure above their FERC level, and those are the steps that are used to set the scarcity pricing mechanisms, which isn't something that the California ISO does. So, I mean, pulling in those other market mechanisms is kind of representing what Don was kind of saying and what I'm trying to support.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Yeah, so from what I understand, there are a few markets that buy more than the NERC required minimums for, say, something like non-spin. So they could sort of extend their curve and relax reserve levels in advance of the shortage. Many of the markets have 30-minute reserves. And then some also have flexi-ramp products as well. So those tend to be, those 3 types of reserves tend to be what populate the sort of right-hand side of the curve that you can, they're sort of voluntary reserves that you can hopefully get into this more gradual increase of price as you move up. But generally, all your points are well taken. Yeah, all your points are well taken, and all part of the problem statements is that there's various barriers to making what we want to accomplish ineffective, a few of which you mentioned.
Thanks, Robert. Let's go ahead and move to Kyle at Cal Advocates, please.
Hey, James. Probably, hopefully this is a quick question, but since Steve broached this question of reality versus theory, I wanted to ask about the 2020 to 2022 Ancillary Services Scarcity Report. It tracks events that were observed across that time frame, and there's a real decreasing steep trend where you had 142 events in 2020, 55 in 21, and then 6 in 2022, and that trend basically holds constant across all the different categories. And I realize that's functionally only like 3 observations, but has that trend continued into 2023? What's behind it? And then is that also true of the power balance constraint violations as well?
Yeah, great question. So that's absolutely true. Is the trend continuing? I'm not sure. I think that's part of where some empirics would help. From the 2022 DMM annual report, they talk a little bit about, increased prevalence of battery storage may have resulted in fewer ancillary service shortages as one primary or as one possible explanation for the trend. but there's probably a lot of different factors at play about why that trend is occurring. And we use that report, those findings from that report. I mean, if you remember, and we presented this to the MSC as well, I mean, I think there were 6 AS shortage events, and I'm not sure that any of those 6 were actually upward AS product shortages. I think they were all rig down shortages. And that included September 2022 when you were in EEA 2 for like 5 straight days and in EEA 3 for several hours on one of those days. And so I think some part of the theme of the comment of like, hey, we have these scarcity pricing mechanisms that aren't kicking in when scarcity is actually happening. That's one piece of evidence that we've used. Now, how to react to, like, how do we design market mechanisms to improve that? You know, that's kind of will be part of the policy discussion, but yeah, I do think it seems like it'd be really valuable to dig in deeper into some of those questions.
Okay, so as I understand it, when you look at that trend, what you're seeing is more that there's a failure in the design to properly identify AS scarcity events.
Yes, only because, well, let's say all else equal, declining AS scarcity is a good thing. We can all agree on that. The reason why that particular trend was troubling in 2022 is because we had emergency conditions in which you would expect to see I mean, that's exactly the time that you want scarcity pricing, and the CAISO's mechanism to effectuate that weren't happening. So I'll sort of answer your question generally. We like the trend, other than it seems to be a signal that things aren't working the way they should, given that it didn't kick in the times that we expected it to.
Okay, all right, thanks for clarifying.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kyle. And let's go to Don.
Hi, Don Trethewey, CISA. I would just make one point and sort of in sort of having a conversation with Steve. You know, a lot of these sort of interesting things that people observe in the real time is because there isn't a full re-optimization of AS and RTPD in FMM. You know, it's just an incremental procurement. There's also, you know, there's no re-optimization or even incremental procurement in RTD. So, you know, those things sort of introduce some additional complexities. I would note, I don't think you can get rid of all of those. You know, if you think about the flexible ramping product, you know, if there were lots of 15-minute import-export bids, they couldn't actually provide FRP, but they could provide energy. And so there could be some interactions there. But I think I would go back to the main point that I was trying to make in my initial comments is a point that Scott Harvey at the MSC has constantly made, is that operators look at what they call latent reserves. So it's not a specific ancillary service product. It's not about how much ramping. They're looking at how much unloaded capacity do I have on the system. And if I start seeing that there's not a lot of latent reserves, which means there's not a lot of unloaded capacity, I'm going to start taking operator actions to prepare for the bad things that are going to come down if it truly ends up that we run out of all of our latent reserves. And so that's where having the scarcity associated with the energy is so important, because, you know, if we only had 50 megawatts of latent reserves, we want to see the price. First of all, you'd see the price for FRP get to the point where you'd relax every single FRP requirement. You want everything now for energy. You'd also be now signaling a price above what your current marginal energy cost is, and that would flow into the co-optimization of the AS, saying my AS is even more valuable now because my energy is even more valuable. So I think it's the need to put into the optimization those latent reserves, and then you get and then coupled with the full re-optimization of ancillary services, that you'll get the price signals that I think everybody's trying to get to.
That makes sense. So just as we said, FRP is an imperfect proxy for capacity, dwindling capacity. Even AS, the requirements themselves may also be an imperfect proxy for various reasons.
Correct.
Yep. Well, I appreciate everyone's discussion, and thanks, Don. And this is exactly what we're hoping to, types of conversations we're hoping to have. So I don't have many more slides, but I do have a couple more things. So I'm going to try to move through them a little quicker than I normally would, so we can get back to you, Juan, for the last portion of it. All the previous discussion was essentially related to reserve shortage pricing. We also have concept of power balance constraint violation, which, as I sort of mentioned in the beginning of the meeting, is usually when someone talks about scarcity pricing or scarcity prices, this is the number and the trigger that they think of, but there's certainly more to it than that. And all this slide is intending to say is that there's a surplus variable associated with power balance constraint violations, just like for any other constraint. It takes value when the market has to relax the power balance constraint. The penalty price associated with that surplus variable is either $1,000 or $2,000, depending on the conditions we're in, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And the mechanism through which the pricing occurs is similar to the example that I already mentioned. Next slide, please. So I do want to take the opportunity to talk about this, an often misunderstood concept about the power balance constraint violation penalty price, which is that it's not the same as a price cap. Okay, so a price cap is sort of a maximum price. Prices can go above the power balance constraint violation penalty price. All that the violation penalty price says is that, generally speaking, if we were to relax the constraint, the surplus variable takes a value of $1,000 or $2,000, depending on the condition. But for various reasons, like for congestion or losses, can push the LMP in certain areas higher than the power balance constraint penalty price. Again, the co-optimization of energy with reserves could lead that reserve shortage pricing could potentially cause energy opportunity costs that push energy prices above the power balance constraint penalty price. So, I mean, it's not hugely important, but, I often do hear and want to make sure it's clear that even the power balance constraint violation penalty price is not a quote unquote cap on energy prices. Now, most of the time, when the power balance constraint price hits, that's what the prevailing system marginal energy cost is. But it's not a guarantee. Next slide, please. Another thing that I want to just make clear is that, in this concept of surplus variables, all these surplus variables have an associated penalty price, which are their administrative prices. And what that means is that it's the CAISO or the market participants together that pick this value that is integrated into the market solution. And it doesn't mean that these are all integrated as part of the market, and the prices are outputs of the market. And it's not as if when the power balance constraint violation occurs, the CAISO is ignoring the market result and inserting its own price. Okay, so part of the reason to have this discussion about surplus variables is that these penalty prices are integrated into the solution, and they're actually outputs from the market solution, and not CAISO going back into the solution and adding its own price. So it's a small but important point. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's now moving into topic number 3, which are scarcity pricing or pricing triggered under specific events. So I want to be clear that the CAISO market doesn't necessarily have any unique pricing rules during load shedding events. And what I want to be clear about what I mean by that. The prices that are published as part of the market clearing process during load shedding events are still outputs of the market optimization, and they're not some other price that the CAISO inserts. So there's not sort of this concept of like a minimum price or a maximum price. It's whatever the market optimization outputs for that interval based on the penalty prices. There are some ISO RTOs that are discussing, whether or not it makes sense to have some sort of floor during a curtailment event. And there's maybe some pros and cons to that. But I just wanted to be clear that even during curtailment situations, the prices are based on the outputs of the market. Now, that being said, there are a few mechanisms to generally sustain emergency prices during emergency events. And that's sort of what the theme of this sort of topic is that various things happen, either operator actions or activation of demand response or strategic reserves or whatever, that can have price suppressing effects in emergency situations that you try not to occur. So let's move to the next slide. Now again, all else equal, low prices are good for consumers, it's good for the market, but under emergency conditions, it's really valuable for system reliability to be publishing prices that reflect the short-term conditions that you're in. And I'll use the phrase, emergency conditions should be associated with emergency pricing. That's the way to promote system reliability. Now, there's a couple of unique things that we do. In the first bullet here, in the market enhancements for 2021 summer readiness, we implemented this change where if the CAISO operators are arming load to meet contingency reserve requirements, which is essentially to say that they're using the potential for load shed to meet their contingency reserves, and they release contingency reserves as energy for immediate use, that the market releases those contingency reserves as energy and puts those bids into the stack at the prevailing power balance or penalty price rather than the resources bid, energy bid. And so that has the effect of making sure when you're in those conditions that you're sustaining emergency prices during emergency conditions. And as far as I'm aware, that seems to be working out pretty well. And perhaps our empirical deep dive can be looking into that as well. Second, RDRR, which is a class of resource that's basically emergency demand response, must submit bids at or above 95% of the relevant bid cap. So again, that's intended to make sure that when you're activating demand response and they're able to set the price, that they're setting a price that what one might consider to be emergency levels and not taking the price. And then generally, so number 3 is kind of really high level, but in general, when we activate demand response of all types, either through the market or out of it, there are various processes to account for demand response in the load forecast to prevent you from double counting the supply, because you don't want to have demand response sort of have an impact on both sides of the supply and demand equation. So to the extent possible, if you can account for supply or demand response and sort of factor that into your load forecast that you're solving the market against, you prevent this sort of big price dip. So with that being said, part of the stakeholder process for scarcity pricing is intended to look into if other mechanisms are needed. Not so much, it's not exactly scarcity pricing in the way we've described for AF shortage pricing or power balance constraint, but are there other things that we should be concerned about during emergency conditions that might put downward pressure on prices at the wrong times? And so that's definitely part of the stakeholder process. Next slide, please. This is my last slide. So the last thing to talk about is FERC Order 831 conditions. And so this is more, I wanted to bring this up because this is about more of the supply side and the ability to bid certain price levels. So FERC Order 831 is to raise the energy bid cap from $1,000 to $2,000, as long as the supplier can submit an energy bid, or suppliers can submit energy bids above $1,000 if they're based on verifiable actual or expected costs. So that if suppliers need to represent costs higher than the prevailing bid cap, they're able to do that if they're verifiable. But the second thing that it does is when FERC Order 831 conditions are triggered, either because the market has received a cost verified energy bid greater than the $1,000 cap, soft cap, or CAISO is calculating a maximum import bid price greater than $1,000, meaning that there's prevailing prices outside of the CAISO throughout the West that are signaling scarce conditions. The power balance constraint penalty price used by the market switches from $1,000 to $2,000, and also all of the penalty prices are then scaled relevant to or related to that change in the power balance price. So as we talked about on that AS shortage curve in the previous slides, if the $2,000 penalty value were to trigger, you're also going to have sort of a doubling of all the relevant AS shortage prices as well. That ends my slides. I hope that was a helpful overview of the current CAISO mechanisms for scarcity pricing. We definitely through the stakeholder discussion highlighted several potential issues, and so that's good. Now, to the extent that there's desire to learn more or to dive deeper about a specific subject, please do include that in your comments so we can be prepared and make sure that stakeholders have the information they need to be making, helping the CAISO make good policy judgments. So I'll pause maybe for one, if I could, I'll pause for a couple more seconds to see if there's any last second questions or comments for my material.
Absolutely, James, and great job. Really appreciate you providing that for this working group so we can kind of move into the discussion well-informed. That was a great presentation. So yeah, taking a look at the time here, I don't want to detract from any questions. So if there are any questions for James and what he presented, or as you mentioned, we will be sending a Survey Monkey. If we could go to slide 34 while we take the questions here. We will be sending a Survey Monkey out to all those in attendance. That will allow us to capture kind of quick feedback on any areas that might need additional elaboration as opposed to the comments template. So again, we're here at your service to have an informed discussion. So right now, James, I see Perry, I see John. I do want to go back. I want to reflect a question that we got here in the chat from Sybil, which kind of goes back to the demand curve structure. James, can you review how the substitution concept fits into the prioritization order in the demand curve structure? We may need a little bit of thank you very much. Let's go ahead and unmute Sybil first to kind of expand there. Sybil, that's on me. A little bit of time has passed, so please.
Sort of relating back to the energy versus the ancillary services dialogue a bit earlier. And so I understand this theoretical concept that's been identified by Don with the bid and ancillary services, but I also thought that the intent behind the structure of those was that you would value sort of more adaptable ancillary service products higher, such that they could substitute for other products sort of lower down in that prioritization order. And so maybe just high level, if you could go back to sort of some of the thinking that goes into how the ancillary service demand curve is structured between the different products, that would be helpful background.
Yeah, good question. So there's sort of two different ways of looking at this concept of hierarchy. One of them is at least for the AS products being regulation up. Well, let's just think of the upward direction. Regulation up, spinning reserve, non-spinning reserve. Those are our three upward AS products. We procure those products in a, what's the right word? They are, the requirement for non-spin can be met by the requirement for spin, and the requirement for spin can be met by the requirement for reg up. So they're cascading. So there is that sort of hierarchy in the market for those products. Now, FRP and imbalance reserve in the day-ahead market don't cascade with the AS products. Okay, so that's one way of looking at it. Number two is their scheduling run penalty prices also reflect the concept of priority and hierarchy, in the sense that the different reserve products have different scheduling run penalty prices to reflect that based on their hierarchy, you will relax or not buy the reserve product of lowest quality first. So in real time, that'd be FRP, then non-spin, then spin, then reg up. In day-ahead market, it'd be imbalance reserve, non-spin, spin, and reg up. So that's sort of the two different ways that their hierarchy comes about. Let me know if you have any follow-up questions to that.
If we could re-unmute Sybil, please.
Thanks, that's helpful. I guess one follow-up question I have, just as it relates to the structure, I noticed that the ERCOT curve there was like a continuous function, and then all of the other curves have these sort of steps in them. And I was wondering if there are pricing issues that have been observed in relation to sort of the steps in the shape of it, as opposed to having a continuous function there. It just seems like that could create sort of maybe a lack of transparency or something. And I think I've heard similar concerns or examples around the sort of triggering of the 831 condition, where maybe there's a lack of visibility or just having sort of step changes in there can sometimes make it challenging to have a clear and transparent price signal. So I don't know if you could opine on that a bit, James.
Sure, yeah. So I think all else equal, reasonable people would agree that the smoother the curve, the better. And that's because the price transitions between values much smoother, and the market signal is also much smoother. Now, in practice, I mean, and Perry kind of brought that up, and maybe he's going to mention that again in his comment, but in practice, the jumpiness of prices between those various steps can, I'm going to use the word issue, can cause issues, but I want to use the word issues really lightly, in terms of, I think the issue I'm not sure if the issue means like a reliability issue, but it certainly is not a market signal that's very consistent. whereby, like sort of as Perry was saying earlier, you could have prices that go from $200 and then spike up to $1,000 because the constraint violated, and then right back down to $150. And as a market participant, that's not reflective. That's confusing, right? And so, to the extent with which you could make that transition between 200 to 1,000 smoother by, signaling the impending shortage further in advance, is probably a good thing, all else equal. Now, there's another challenge in that, you'll notice ERCOT has that nice smooth curve, and all the other ISOs tend to have the more blocky curves. I mean, just simply in practice, implementing the blocky curves seems to be simpler in terms of the impact on software because they're discrete, and that also weighs in on sort of the limits to which sort of the smoothness can be achieved by the limits of the software itself. And so if you had even if you do have blocks, as long as they're reasonably close together and the quote unquote jumpiness is relatively small, it's probably not going to be that big a deal. So I think that's what I would say. Let me know if you have any follow-up to that. And just FYI for participants, anytime that you put you mute yourself on WebEx, the operator has to then unmute you. So if there's multi-part questions, keep your line unmuted on WebEx.
Absolutely, and we got something in chat here that answered the question, and thank you to you, James, and that was helpful. Let's go ahead and move to Perry.
Hey, James, Perry Servideo, CISA. I just wanted to go back to the slide that you have on 831. I believe it was slide 27. Yeah, so this one, I just wanted to ask if you would consider it in scope to be looking at energy storage resources bidding above $1,000 whenever these bid caps go up. It's a kind of a simple thing, and it's an issue that we see today, and it definitely impacts price formation. More importantly, I think it's an operation. It should be considered an operational concern by CAISO, and today, currently, energy storage resources, even when these caps go up, are not able to reflect this opportunity cost in their bids, and therefore the market will start to discharge them earlier in the day. Whereas if they were able to reflect the opportunity cost, the market would then use them according to the reliability that it needs. So, long-winded way to ask, is that in scope here due to its price formation impact?
Yeah, it definitely is. It's on our radar, and it was something that we reflected. And don't remember exactly which documentation it was that we produced, but it hasn't gotten as much airtime because it's inherently not as complicated as some of these things, but it's for sure on our radar.
Okay, yeah, that's good. It seemed to me to be like a really simple, quick hit at getting a little bit better price formation on those days that you need it. The other point that I wanted to make related to 831 is I've been kind of calling this cost conditional offer cap raising here, and that is that these offer caps, they move up whenever you've kind of verified that supply is more costly, and this is a lot of times this can be completely divorced from whether there's scarcity. So it is related in a way, but I wanted to caution that you may have instances of scarcity where you don't move caps. Just a problem with having this sort of step for these caps that are actually based on the costs. That was all vetted back in the 831 days, but I just wanted to at least provide that nexus here with this with this stakeholder discussion. And just to give you like a sense of that, I've, you know, you can find multiple times where this happened, but there was an event on July 9th in 2021. Sorry for going back to 2021 for you. But what happened on this day was a genuine scarcity event, but none of the cost conditions within 831 allowed the scarcity reserve demand curve to scale up to $2,000 a megawatt hour. And just to give you a sense of what was going on that day, there were fire threats to the transmission lines. CAISO was forecasting, you know, bona fide deficiencies in supply. And I think, yeah, definitely CAISO declared an EEA2 on that day, and then declared an EEA3 and began arming load. So lots of things were happening, yet the culmination of all of that happening were market clearing prices that were close to $1,000. So I just wanted to illustrate that this can happen, and it's not. It has to do with the 831 rules that you have in place here. But when you look at things through the lens of scarcity pricing, these kind of things, cost conditional offer cap raising, don't quite make sense. At least I wanted to put that out there for you.
Yeah, thanks. I hadn't really thought of that, but that's interesting. I mean, I've definitely thought of the opposite, where you can have cost verified bids that are above $1,000 in situations when there's not scarcity potentially. For example, if you have something crazy happening in the gas market or something.
Right.
But I guess the flip side is true too. That's interesting.
Right. So I would hope that, you know, maybe a holistic look at this, the interaction between 831 and true good scarcity pricing would be in scope for this.
Thank you.
Perry, let's go to John from SRP.
Yeah, so kind of in the same vein here, I'm understanding that there's $1,000 soft cap, $2,000 hard cap. $2,000 hard cap degrades with time in order to get us to respond right away for scarcity pricing. And earlier you mentioned, by earlier I actually mean later, compared to the part that everybody's talking about, which is that graph that we spent a lot of time on. A little bit later, you had mentioned that the $2,000 cap is set according to the relation to market prices in a separate market other than the CAISO market. What other market are you referring to in that regard?
So just to make sure I'm following, are you asking when the CAISO can trigger higher power or higher penalty prices for its power balance constraint based on external market conditions? What that means? Yes,
although you did not use the term external market conditions, you said in relation to another power market in the West. The pricing in another power market in the West, and that's where I was wondering what power market you were referring to in the West that was not CAISO.
So yeah, maybe I misspoke, but I think what I was trying to say is that FERC order, and this is related to FERC order 831 conditions, right? Or is this way before that?
No, it's going to be around the FERC order 831 conditions and a little bit after that.
Oh, okay. So I think I got it then. So in bullet 2, number 2 here, it says CAISO has calculated a maximum import bid price greater than $1,000. And so part of the FERC order 831 process involves how do you sort of cost verify a non-resource specific import where you don't know really what type of unit is going on and can't necessarily verify its cost. And the way that CAISO implemented FERC order 831 was to at the bilateral hubs and and apply what we call a shaping factor to those hubs. So as you probably know, the hubs are a block price but the CAISO applies some sort of method to turn that block price into an hourly price that's shaped based on the sort of load profile. And if under that methodology, the prices are above the $1,000, then that's sort of how the CAISO cost verifies a non-resource specific import, and could if one of those had been submitted, could trigger the penalty price to rise to $2,000.
So is that for any single one? Or is there a combination that has to occur? Is there a certain mass that has to occur for the trigger, or is it still kind of?
That's a good question, because there are multiple hubs, and I don't know if it's one or all of them. Maybe somebody else on the call knows the answer to that question. I'm not sure. I know somebody out there. I know somebody in the audience knows, but yeah, in any case, yeah, because since there's multiple hubs, I'm not sure if the trigger means that all of the hubs have to be over the 1,000 or one. But I think, I mean, thinking about it more, it could be that, like, if you have, say, a Southwest hub, and I forget the hub's name, so I know that's common knowledge for some people, but I forget what the hubs are called. But you have a Southwest hub, and if you're, maybe the process is, if I'm supplying a non-resource specific import at that sort of scheduling point, and the hub price at that location is above the $1,000, I'm able to bid into the CAISO at that scheduling point over 1,000. So maybe there's some sort of connection between the hubs and the scheduling point.
Okay, if possible, I think we'd like a little bit more clarity on that. There probably is already some existing documentation for it somewhere, and if you could just send it or reference it, that would help.
Will do. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
So yeah, no, back to slide 34 there. Thank you. James, thank you so much for giving us a very in-depth look there. And I know we could get deeper, and we heard quite a bit from our stakeholders on additional pieces of information or areas to dive into that we will be providing. Let us take a look at perhaps the best method to do that, whether that is to simply point folks towards more resources or another mechanism to provide responses to a lot of these really good questions. We are going to, we're not going to have the time to go through some of these problem statements that you have that are on the deck. It is posted on the initiative website. We sincerely hope that this review of the existing mechanisms was helpful. It had really good conversation throughout some of those questions. So perhaps we can take this opportunity to really take a look at those draft problem statements as well. We're going to edit our comment template to be reflective of the fact that we did not get to those problem statements, and maybe we can take a little bit of time for you guys to absorb the information that James provided and then give us your thoughts there. I want to just, while we're on this slide, are there any additional areas that require additional context? Again, we will be serving or sending that SurveyMonkey out to you. And we look forward to hearing your feedback so that we can make sure that we're having an informed discussion moving forward into these thematic areas. So absolutely. So the due date for comments on today's workshop, we'll put that out with just a traditional 2 weeks there, Kyle. But again, that SurveyMonkey should be going out early tomorrow. And we're trying to take a look at getting responses to those as quickly as we can. And Vijay, absolutely our pleasure. That is precisely what we were going for. As James has alluded to several times with some of these questions, this was meant to serve as ensuring we have this review done. This is as it operates today. And now we can really dive into, potential enhancements, changes. And when we're looking at, the questions of the intent of, is the intent of the ISO to have the policy design be in one direction or the other. This is more to serve as that foundational base so that we together as a stakeholder community can get through that issue identification, refining of problem statements, and then potential solutioning into that policy development process. So that was the intent of today, and we're looking to you to help us inform the policy design through this working group. So I'm going to go ahead and toss this over to Brenda, and a big thank you to everybody here. Brenda, the floor is yours. Oh. Okay, so sorry about that, Brenda. We're not having your audio come through here. So just I'll do my best to channel you. I'm not going to do as good of a job as you, but the next steps here, we are going to be posting a revised working group schedule to go into the other themes. This review, and I think it served a good need here. Through this real robust discussion on the current mechanisms. We will be posting to the initiative page the working group schedule telegraphing where we have each upcoming theme. We would ask of our stakeholders here if there are particular themes that you are interested in presenting your perspective on. We would love to open the floor of the working group to give you that forum, so to speak, to present to the stakeholder community on those particular scope items. And we really appreciate everybody's time. So if we could move to the next slide. And Brenda, let's see if you have audio here.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay, I apologize for that. I had my mic not connected all the way. Yeah, so thanks, Juan, for that. So we'll do our best for adding that SurveyMonkey for tomorrow's daily briefing, in case we are able to send that out, but also send out a target email. The comments are due for the working group session 6 from last time we met is on November 3rd. That link is still active. Please submit those comments when you can. That's located on the initiative website. And we do want to make sure, like, if there's anything that we're able to address, we'll make sure to send it out in notice. But other than that, thanks so much to Juan, James, and CV for all your support. I apologize for the audio. My audio wasn't working for a second, but thanks so much. And I think that's all. We can go ahead and close our call. Thanks so much for everyone and have a great day.